1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Is that okay?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out on a dreary morning in Victoria for this public event. We run a series of events like this at Landscapes of Justice Spring Institutes, and it's a real pleasure and honor that we have on this project to be able to work with people who lived through this history, both the internment era itself and today's session, both Audrey Kobayashi and our Miki taking an active role in redress. So great moments within this history where we have people with first-hand experience who've also been very generous with us in sharing their time and their stories with us. So I'm really pleased to introduce both of them, and then Audrey and Art will talk about the road to redress. Arthur Miki's had a distinguished career as an educator and community activist. He began his career as an elementary school teacher and later served as principal for 18 years. He is, I think still, you have to correct me if any of your titles are out of date, Art, but he is president of the Asian Heritage Society of Manitoba that organizes Asian Heritage Month activities, and also still president of the Japanese Cultural Association of Manitoba.
Yes.
Mr. Miki was the president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians when he led negotiations to achieve a just redress settlement for Japanese Canadians for the actions of the Canadian government during the Second World War in the 1940s. In 1991, he received this country's highest recognition, the Order of Canada, and in 2012, the Order of Manitoba. Mr. Miki was a citizenship judge for Manitoba and Saskatchewan from 1998 to 2008. And he's also an author, having authored, among other things, the Japanese Canadian Redress Legacy, A Community Revised. Audrey Kobayashi also has a long history of writing and activism within the Japanese Canadian community. In addition to her participation in the Landscapes of Justice project, she's also presently involved in the second phase of the Right to Remain project, which includes a number of university researchers and graduate students in partnership with community advocacy organizations of the downtown east side in Vancouver, where rapidly increasing property prices and gentrification threaten the precarious residents in hundreds of single occupancy residencies, or SROs, many of which were formerly owned by Japanese Canadians who were forced out of the area in the 1940s. A native of British Columbia, Audrey Kobayashi completed her BA and MA at the University of British Columbia and her PhD at UCLA. She taught geography and East Asian studies at McGill University from 1983 to 1994, and then came to Queen's, initially as the director of the Institute of Women's Studies, and then as professor of geography. In 1994, Audrey was a Fulbright Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. She's the former president of the Canadian Association of Geographers, former editor of People, Place, and Region, the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, an organization of which she is also the former president. So two distinguished speakers today in conversation about the road to redress.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here at 8:30 in the morning. I am honored and delighted to be able to have a conversation with Art Miki. You can just think of it as two seniors getting together to reminisce. So if we get too far into the reminiscences, just let us know. I want to start by going back to the 1970s. When we were not exactly kids, but young. And yesterday, Jordan showed a photograph of Gordon Cadota and his presentation to Parliament in the early 1970s, which I'm not sure how many Nikkei knew that presentation was going on, but it really was a turning point, almost spiritually, in the understanding of Japanese Canadians as an organized group of their place in Canadian history. Everyone knew, of course, about the experiences of the 1940s. At that time, most people still had experienced the 1940s, but this was at the start of a different time when Japanese Canadians as a community had a sense of their place in the geography and history of this country. So I want to start with that turning point, because after that, the centennial was coming up. We're not so sure what that centennial was actually celebrating in terms of the historical records, but it was a tremendous symbolic time. The whole country got together in planning that centennial in 1977.
Right.
I was a graduate student at UBC at the time, and I remember I wasn't very excited about the celebrations because, I was a radical at UBC to the extent that UBC is radical. And I was concerned about redress. And there was a bunch of us who were concerned about redress, and we had meetings at Aki Restaurant, and we're really determined to do something in order to make the Canadian government accountable. But it was still a sort of disparate thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I remember Gordon Cadota standing on the stage at the first Powell Street Festival in Oppenheimer Park, or Powell Ground as we call it. And I remember the passion, the fire, and the way he got everybody excited. So, Art, I want you, if you can, I know you can, start in 1977 and maybe start by just telling us what it was like, how you got involved, and not too long after that, you became president of the NAJC, and the rest is history.
Well, thank you, Audrey. Well, again, welcome everyone this morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to share the story. For the people here, this year is the 30th anniversary of the Japanese Canadian Redress settlement, and when you said, two old people, you're right. That was a long time ago. And but it's interesting, it's something that certainly I will never forget. My involvement began with, as you said, the Japanese Canadian Centennial Society. I was representing Manitoba. And the idea was to get people from across the country together to celebrate this occasion of 100 years from the first immigrant. And that's questioned now, but at that point it became a focus for our community to get together. And it was interesting because through the gatherings there were certain projects that developed. I can remember the Japanese Canadian pictorial history that was developed in Vancouver, and that traveled across the country. And I know Winnipeg, we had it set up in the Hudson Bay Company store, and so the public was able to come and visit and look at the information. And so in a way, that was the beginning of really unveiling our history to the public. And also, it gave an opportunity for many people in our community to speak about their experiences. At that time, I had Tom Shoyama come to Winnipeg in 1978 or 77, and he gave a lecture on his experience and what happened to him in his early years. That type of thing awakened a lot of the young people because many of them said they never knew that happened. And they didn't realize that their parents came to Manitoba as a result of being forcibly removed. Many of them thought that parents made a choice, and they often questioned, why did you come here? But they didn't realize the real story behind it. And some of them, after meetings, are very angry at their parents for not telling them, because it was something that they had not really discussed in their homes. And the same applied in my family as well. I began to learn all about this around 1977, 78, when Anson O'Hara's book was also released, The Politics of Racism. And all of that gave information about what happened to the community and recognizing that it was certainly a wrong done. The documents began to reveal that. And so it was through that, my involvement. And the following year in '78, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, at that time it was called the National Japanese Canadian Citizens Association, and they set up a redress committee. And in 1980, the committee reported indicating that one of the ways of rectifying the wrongs of the past would be to seek an apology and also a foundation or a community fund. It was a foundation as a symbolic gesture on the part of the government. And that was sort of the position they adopted. Not everyone was happy with that. But the difficulty, the organization, I became president in 1984. And it was in 1983, there was a meeting called of the National Council. We were all invited to Toronto, but the Redress Committee, silently, quietly, behind the backs of even the president of the association, sort of made an informal deal with the government that they would accept the apology and this fund, whatever it might be. We were sent to Ottawa, or to Toronto, and we had this discussion. The committee wanted us to endorse it. People began to question. First of all, you didn't consult with the community, and now you're putting forward a position. And many people questioned the fact that individual compensation wasn't even considered as part of the mix. And so as a result, the council rejected the proposal. Meanwhile, this group got funding separate from the National Association to conduct this meeting of $100,000 to conduct this meeting with the intent that they would deliver the agreement, or they would deliver our support for it. Well, that fell through. And the Redress Committee at that time talked about resigning, etc. Well, Japanese people are very interesting because even though a lot of people said they should resign, there were a number of them who said, well, let's not do something like that. It's not Japanese to get rid of people, that type of thing. So anyways, that committee stayed on. I became president in 1984. At that point, the National Association adopted an official position that we would seek an acknowledgement, not an apology, acknowledgement, some form of compensation, and the repeal of the War Measures Act. That was the position that was adopted. The council adopted it. The National Redress Committee that was part of it, they also made the council also made a stipulation that this committee was now accountable to the executive, to the president, to the National Council, because up to this point they were operating independently of each other, and so to tighten the relationship, that was adopted. Well, the same people who had proposed the original position of foundation, they still were on this redress committee. And so we had a conflict within our organization. The committee still continued not to want individual compensation. What we found out is that these people had very close connections with the government. And they made a deal, silently, and they were trying to push it regardless of where the community stood. And so that became a big issue. It came to a point where this group, without the endorsement of the National Council or the executive, had arranged to have an apology given in the House of Parliament. And they began to contact people in our community. And one of the members of our council phoned me one day and said, did you know that we were invited to Ottawa for an announcement? And I said, no, I have not heard anything about it. it was this group that decided that they would do that without consulting us or even letting us know, despite the fact that they were accountable to us. When I found out about that, Henry Kojima and I, who live in Winnipeg, contacted Lloyd Laxerty, who was a Liberal cabinet minister, and we met with them and said, first of all, this is not something that this association has endorsed. It's something that's being done within our own community, but the National Association has not endorsed it or approved it. And he took that back to his cabinet. So that day that they were going to bring in all these people were canceled. But the government, because they had indicated that they would do this, made in the House of Commons expression of regret. David Cullen expressed regret on behalf of the government of what happened to Japanese Canadians. Meanwhile, we had indicated to the press that we reject the action of the government. It was just at a time when the Liberal government was going to, they were going to prorogue Parliament. It was the second or last day of Parliament, and that's when Mulroney was in there. He was now the opposition leader, and he questioned about redress for Japanese Canadians, and Pierre Trudeau said, first of all, we would not compensate Japanese Canadians. In fact, we can't change the past. Let's move ahead to the future, but he would not support it. Fortunately for us, Mulroney stands up in retaliation, says, if it were the Conservative government, we would surely compensate Japanese Canadians. Great news. Right away we sent a letter to him expressing our support, but lo and behold, he becomes the Prime Minister. That fall there's an election. And the Prime Minister, he becomes a Prime Minister. So the first thing we do, send him a letter, reminder. And you know what? He reacted very quickly, appointed the Minister of Multiculturalism, and within 2 months, within a month or so, we had a meeting arranged in Winnipeg. And so it was in December of '84, we had this meeting. And we bring in the National Council to this meeting. It was mainly run by the bureaucrats from Minister Murda's office. And in the end, we agreed to a negotiations process. There's a press release sent out saying that the National Association of Japanese Canadians and the government has agreed to a negotiation process to rectify the wrongs of the past. So we're extremely happy. And so in January, a few weeks later, we start the process of negotiations. We meet 4 times in January, once a week, we're meeting, and then we begin to realize that they're not negotiating. They're basically having the same position, except that the quantum from 5, or they raised it to $6 million from 5 for a community fund and an apology, but they're not prepared to consider individual. We actually, and one of the things that really frightened us is that the minister's office said, well, if you don't agree to it, we're going to put it through the House of Commons. So then we get on our boats, or we decide that we have to go to Ottawa. So we take the team to Ottawa, and we set up meetings with the opposition parties. Because, you know, in government, the opposition plays an important role. We met with the Liberal government, and we were very careful of what kind of support we wanted. What we said to them is, we want you to support us in a negotiated settlement. Negotiated means that both parties agree. And we knew at that point there were a number of MPs, if they heard a quantum of even 100,000 or whatever, they would react negatively. And I had that confirmed a few years after by Sergio Marchi, because he was one of the people we met. And he told me, he said, if you had come in with us, the Liberals, supporting individual compensation, we would have not supported you.
Let me just make a little clarification there. So we're still dealing with the Liberal government before Mulroney is appointed, right? And all of those, several years, right? 4 years with the Liberal government in which they won't support.
No, it's the Conservative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, you got ahead of me.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, we're dealing, when this process and negotiation was entered into, it was with the Conservative government. But in the end, we recognized that there was no intent to negotiate and sit down and work out an arrangement. They were going to impose some type of settlement. So we go to Ottawa, we meet with the Liberal caucus, they support the idea of negotiated settlement. We go to see Ed Broadbent and the NDP caucus, we're sitting, meeting with him, and his staff member comes in and he says, we just have a note from the House leader, they would like to put forward a motion tomorrow morning on the Japanese-Canadian redress. And we're sitting there, and Ed Broadbent turns to me, he says, do you know anything about this? I said, no. I said, there's no way that we've come to any agreement with the government. So he told the person to tell the House leader they would not support it. That died. I often wonder, had we not been there at that exact moment, whether it would have gone through, because they had planned to put it through. But that's when we realized that the negotiation process was not a negotiation process. Right after that, the CBC picked up the story, because it became a press item that there's this that satisfaction with the NAJC with the process. And so I was on the national. Barbara Frum, for those who are older will remember her. She was the host, and she had the minister and myself on there. And she said to the minister, did you not agree to a negotiations process? Didn't you send out a press release? Oh yes, we did that. But then in the end he said, we didn't really mean negotiate, we wanted to consult. That statement lost him his job, because right away the press picked that up, and it was again a feeling that they had not lived up to their agreement. So you get an appointment of a second person, and this whole thing is interesting. I'm going to get back to the political part, but because within our own community, though, there is this dissatisfaction. As I told you, there's a group of people who are trying to put through something that did not have the approval of National Council. In the end, after the attempt of the apology with the Liberal government, we had a meeting and we actually disbanded the National Redress Committee. Those same people went off and formed their own group, and they began to lobby the government saying, we'll agree to your proposal. And they're saying, we represent the, what was the term they used? The majority, the silent majority. That was the term they used. We represent the silent majority. The NAJC represents these groups of organizations. But we
Radicals.
we were radicals actually. So anyways, as a result of that, they formed their own group and we disbanded it. And so we established the Redress Strategy Committee, which I was on, and Audrey, a number of our community people were part of it. And so we began to develop a process. Through our experience of negotiations, we recognized a few things. With the government in January, first of all, the minister one day said to us in our meeting, he says, what did your community really lose? Simple question. What did your community really lose? And you know what? We couldn't answer that question. We could say, well, they lost their property, education, all of those things. He says, how much did your community lose? And that's when we began to think, we need to develop a process. that's when we tried to have a study of economic losses. So we did fundraising in our community, and at this point, there wasn't that much support by our community members, where a lot of people, especially the first generation people who were not supportive at all, they kept saying, she got the guy, just leave it alone, don't bother. There were other people who said, we've established ourselves, and by entering into this discussion with the government and asking for compensation, we're going to get backlash, our neighbors will turn against us. There was this fear, and I can understand that concern, but there was that fear. And so we didn't have much support. So here we have this problem. We're going to do an economic losses study. We checked with some accounting firms. The cheapest we could get is $150,000. So we start fundraising. Well, when you have a very small proportion of your community supporting you, you don't get that much money. We did get funds from the City of Toronto, $5,000. City of Lethbridge gave us $3,000 for this research. But in our own community, we just couldn't raise enough. We only raised about $29,000. And so Vivian, who's in our audience, Henry Kobayashi, who was helping us, said, you know what, I know the president of Price Waterhouse. So we set up another meeting with Price Waterhouse, because they were the ones who quoted 150. And we met with Phil Barter, and he listened to our plight, and in the end he said, he said, my father was president of Price Waterhouse at the time of the internment. And he often said that should have never happened. It might have been that he had a friend or someone who was being sent away. He said, this is wrong. And so Phil Barter said, you know what, maybe we could do something. We are prepared to do your study. If you can just pay the upfront cost of sending someone to research in Ottawa in the archives, etc., we'll do it for you. And he said, if you ever get redress, you can pay us that. So that's how this study came around. And so in 1986, we had this Price Waterhouse report, study quantifying the losses, and this is minimal losses because they couldn't do pain and suffering, they couldn't do loss of education, they couldn't even do loss of business, because the argument is that businesses could fall in at any time, so there's no guarantee. The only thing they could quantify was property, worked out to $443 million in 1986 dollars. So that was the result. The second part that we did is we had a national survey on forms of compensation, because up to this point, this group who was opposed to individual compensation kept telling people no one wants individual compensation. People don't want it. And that we're being greedy by asking for it. So we did a national survey. 2,000 responses. The majority supported individual compensation. There were a number who preferred community fund. But when we put it together, we recognized that individual compensation was a very important component of what we should be seeking. It was sort of a mandate that we had, and yet the government was not willing to consider it at all. And the divisions in our community began to disappear once this particular group in Toronto, stationed out of Toronto, did something that was pretty unethical. They had met with Aldo Jelinek, who was certainly not a supporter at all. In fact, the first time I ever met him, he made a big boo-boo because he was sports minister. He says, well, I'll meet you at the airport. And so we met at the airport, and his chief of staff is there waiting for him. And he says to me, how are you, Mr. Oki? To me. And Mr. Oki was the one who was one of the people leading the other group. And so obviously they had already met with him and that group. And I didn't know. This is the first time meeting all of John there. So anyways, we get into this room at the airport. I bring down a number of our community members, and all the Jelinek says to us in his opening that, yes, I understand. He says, I understand your problem very well. He says, you know what? I was an immigrant too. And one of our seniors just stood up and said, we're not immigrants, we're Canadian citizens. Obviously, you don't understand this at all. And so we just walked out of the room. Because at that point, there was really no point in discussing it. But later on, we get a call to meet Otto Jelinek in Ottawa. And so we go down there. We get to this meeting in his office, and we walk in, and there's a whole slew of press there, with cameras and all that. And he says to me, do you mind if the press takes some pictures before our discussion? So they're clicking and all that, and then they disappear. We have this meeting, we're wondering, has something significant come around that we get called? And he said to us, he says, we don't think that you represent Japanese Canadians officially. He said, we have word that you're not the real representative. He said, we're holding a press conference. He said, would you like to join me in the press conference? I said, no way. We wouldn't. So we go to the press conference, and he makes this announcement that the National Association of Japanese Canadians is not the true representative of the Japanese Canadian community. And then he reads out a list of all these organizations in Toronto who indicate that they support the other group. About 10 or 15 names of organizations. Fortunately, that same list was given to the city of Toronto when we were applying for a $5,000 grant, and the same group was opposing the grant to the National Association. And they presented that list. So meanwhile, our supporters went through the list and checked every organization, contacted them, and none of them had ever been contacted by this group. They didn't even know their name was on their list. There were 2 or 3 organizations that were defunct. And Otto Jelinek is reading this list, and we said, oh my God. So the next day we called a press conference, and we denounced his statement and his accusations, etc. And so we had a national story. Toronto Sun, Nancy Knickerbocker had contacted a number of people, these organizations, and true enough, none of them had heard at all. It was all a sham. And so, in essence, his credibility went down the drain. And we knew that he was supporting the other group because we heard that he had funded some events for them to garner support. And when I met him and I accused him of that, he would not say we didn't do it. He just skated around the issue like his figure skating career did, I guess. And he just said, well, Mr. Miki, people do this and that. I said, did you arrange to have this group? Did you fund it? No, well, he never said no to the whole thing, so we knew that he did. And one of the interesting things about Jelinek is there's a situation. The government was very conscious of the fact that there's a press conference tomorrow, and if the Prime Minister is going to be there, that question of redress will come up. And so one day I'm sitting I'm at a national conference for mathematics teachers. I'm chairing a session, and in the middle of the session, 2 people open the door, and they stand there and say, is Mr. Miki here? I said, I'm here. We have to see you, it's an emergency. So I go out the door, and I had to apologize to all these people. I go out the door, and they said, the Minister Jelinek wants to meet you today. It's urgent that we meet. And I said, well, I have a press interview with CBC at 4:30. And they said, well, we'll have a taxi there waiting for you. As soon as you finish, we'll take you over to the Fort Garry Hotel where the meeting was going to take place. I phoned one of my colleagues, Harold Hirose, to say, Harold, you got to join me because it's an emergency meeting. I wanted to have another person there with me. So we get to this meeting, and Jelinek comes and shakes his hand, and he said, excuse me, I'll be right back. Disappears for about 10 minutes, comes back, and we sit down, and I said, so what's the issue? He says, well, our position hasn't changed. I said, well, why did you call me? He just shook his head, and then we walked away. Interesting, that night, I phoned my brother in Vancouver, and I said to him, strangest thing happened today. And he said he attended a press conference in Vancouver with Mulroney. And the question of redress was raised about what are you doing? And Mulroney's response was, he said, at this very moment, in Winnipeg, the minister is meeting with Mr. Miki. And it subdued the whole thing. And so that's the ploy that was used to make sure that that contact is made. I mean, and so and Mulroney shortly after that was let go. And then we went into David Crombie, who kept telling us that
Jelinek was let go.
Pardon?
Jelinek was let go.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Crombie.
And moved to Crombie. And Crombie, who was the minister for Indian Affairs, etc., we saw people were quite pleased that we had him, but in the end it turned out that he was no different in the sense, and we gave him about a year. And then when we finally met in Winnipeg, he said to us, he said, this is a final offer. If you don't take it, negotiations are finished. And so we decided at that point that we would walk away and say, fine, negotiations are over. And we did, and we walked away. And I said to him, one of the issues that we're concerned about is individual compensation. You're not even willing to consider these things. He said, oh yeah, he says, you can, why don't you take the 13 million, it would have gone up to 12 or 13 million by now, for community funds. He said, why don't you take that and give it to individuals? And I said, well, that's $800 per person. I don't think that would even buy anything in our community. So anyways, we walked away. And so it became dormant. But it became an issue for us because then we didn't know what to do. We had to change our strategy. Up to now, it was just us with the government. That was just going back and forth, and that was it. And came to a standstill. And so we got together in Vancouver, and we brainstormed how we should approach it. And we decided that what we would do is to form a national coalition of for Japanese Canadian redress. And the national coalition meant that we would include Canadians generally who wanted to support us. We got Tom Berger as the honorary chair from Vancouver, and we had a number of prominent Canadians, Pierre Burton, Margaret Atwood, Joy Kogawa was able to get some of the top writers to join. We had other politicians join, mayors of cities. Eventually we got all the unions in Canada, the major unions, to support us. We got all the churches in Canada, except for one, which was the Buddhist churches of Canada. But I can understand their position because, you know, if you know their philosophy, they don't question what happens in the past. It's, that's part of your living is that you face difficulties, but you always move on. And so they didn't feel that we should just move on. But one of the things they did say is that if individuals want to support you, that's fine. But as a church, we cannot endorse you. And we even met with the veterans organizations, Chatterton with War Amps. And again, they wouldn't support us, but he said to us, he said, you know, we let the individual veterans decide on where they stand on this issue, but we would not dictate to them that they would support us. So anyways, we left at that. But that coalition...
Assembly of First Nations was also pretty important.
Yeah. And all the communities, we had quite a large forum in Toronto where all the accent communities were there. And so this idea of a coalition is getting other Canadians involved. We had a postcard campaign where we gave postcards out to people and they signed it, and we had about 4,000 or 5,000 postcards. And then we had a culmination of this activity by having a march in Ottawa. And we marched on Parliament Hill. And I recall, even within our own community, we had people who said, no, 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 you don't do that. Japanese people do not march. They don't protest. They don't march. And
This is April 1988, right?
Yeah, April 9, and they were pretty offended, some of the people, but we decided that the Canadian way is that we do it, and we did it. And we had something like 400 to 500 people who came from different parts of Ontario. Some came from out west, and they marched on Parliament Hill. All of the people who had gone through the internment, it was quite a show. Very solemn, quiet, no rah, 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 or anything like that. And we held a session of speakers. All these coalition speakers came and spoke, representing the churches, the civil libertarian groups, and so on. And even Wiener, who was appointed Minister of Multiculturalism, attended, despite the fact that he was warned by his staff not to go.
I think it was his first public speech.
Yeah, first public speech, and he was warned not to go, and they said, look what happened to your 3 predecessors. They were all fired. But he said, he told us he felt obligated to go. At that point, there may have been already a change taking place in the government that we didn't know about. Anyways, the rally was a success. We had national coverage. We had the victims of internment in the faces of cameras. It was important. Canadian public began to recognize that these are people right here who have suffered. It wasn't just some abstract group of people. And so it was very powerful. Shortly after that, I got a call from the minister saying, I should go back a little bit. We had all these postcards, and there were about 500. We had mailbox full of it, mail bags, and Jerry Wiener offered to walk with this group to the Prime Minister's office to dump off the postcards. And I thought that was quite a good gesture on his part, that he would do that for us.
From the West Wing to the Prime Minister's office, carrying massive bags of yellow postcards. But I just wanted to just challenge one other thing. I don't think it was that quiet.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we had Tycho, and we had Indigenous drummers. And in one of the few occasions that I've seen, we had this drumming jam session that was really fantastic and really loud. It reverberated all over Parliament. Maybe you forgot that part.
Well, remember, I'm partly deaf. No, I'm just kidding, No, certainly they were there, and the night before the rally, we had a big get-together in the hotel. We had big celebrations, and a lot of the MPs came, and it was exciting, really. And so that set the tone for the next day. And as I said, it was a powerful impact that I think it had, because shortly after the Prime Minister's, the Minister of Multiculturalism called me and said, we have to meet. And I said, well, first of all, I said, we're not meeting unless we can discuss individual compensation. And he said, I've talked to the Prime Minister. He says, everything's on the table. So we said, okay, we'll go and meet. And we met. And the biggest fear that the Prime Minister's office had was, because they had already rejected our negotiation process and we had walked away, is they wanted to save face, and they're wondering, how can we begin the action again? And so we made suggestions such as, why don't you set up three-man committee made up of representatives, and they make a recommendation, or get one individual, someone that we can both agree on to make recommendation, etc. We waited to get a response, and the difficulty for them was the payment, the financing of it. Because if they had to pay out, they would have to go to Privy Council. And going to Privy Council meant that you have to let other politicians know that you were doing this. And the Prime Minister was very coy about this. He kept everything quiet. And so as a result, he decided not to go to Privy Council because they were afraid that if you went to Privy Council, someone's going to raise that question of why are you doing this? And you would get the reaction against it. So in the end, they said the Prime Minister has found some money from his own slush fund. I don't know how large it is. But anyways, it's a go-ahead. So we went and we met in Ottawa, August 25th to 27th, I think it was. Montreal. Montreal. And we were at what hotel? The big hotel there.
Well, we were at the Delta, but we started out at the Ritz-Carlton.
Ritz-Carlton.
And they took us in through the kitchen so
Yeah.
the press wouldn't see us.
That's right. We're going, in the kitchen, up backstairs, and we get up to the room where the meeting will be held. And interesting enough, the person that's there waiting for us is Lucien Bouchard. And Lucien Bouchard sits down with us. He said, he was very close to the Prime Minister at the time because he was appointed by the Prime Minister to be Secretary of State in Cabinet. So he was just appointed, and so he attended. And he said to us, he said, the government is willing to offer $15,000 individual compensation. That's the first thing he said. And we said, oh my God. This is serious. So anyways, that was the starting point. So they laid it right on the table that individual compensation was the goal. And so in the end, we hammered back and forth for a couple of days, and they wanted all kinds of details about what would we do with the money if we had a community fund. And we brainstormed as a group, we'd meet back, it was through this process. And we ended up at $20,000 individual compensation. And I forget what the community fund was. It was a little higher than what we have. And they agreed to all the terms that we had laid out, except that the quantum was different. So we're at $20,000, and we do a little history lesson with them about the treatment of Japanese Canadians being more severe, and and I said, and we're saying, wouldn't it be nice if ours was a little bit higher, symbolically? And the minister said, well, maybe we could do that. And so they cut down the community fund a bit and shifted the money to individuals. So that's how we got 21,000. People often ask me, why 21,000? Instead of 20 or 25 or whatever. And so we explained the rationale behind it. And so they agreed to it. They agreed to a $12 million community fund. They agreed to a formation of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And the reason for that foundation is the fact that when we were trying to do the study for economic losses, we had applied or asked the government to fund it, and they rejected us. They said, why would we fund you and have you use this study against us? And we said, well, that's logical too. And so we accepted that, and so we had to fund our own. But anyways, the Canadian Racers, and that's when we recognized as an organization that there must be other groups such as us in similar situations. Where would they get support? Where would they ever, if the government won't support them, where would they? And so that's the genesis of forming the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to help other groups. And so that was accepted. And in fact, the way we worked that out is that $12 million we contributed, and that was on behalf of all those people who had already passed away before the redress settlement. symbolically to represent them, and the government contributed $12 million. So there's a $24 million endowment for that organization at the present time. Unfortunately, at the time that we're looking at this, the interest rate was running 10%. So we figured $2.5 million a year for operations should work out. Well, the interest rate went down, and now they're having difficulty, surviving. Well, they are surviving, but it's more difficult. They can't do the programs that they should be doing, I guess.
But what Art isn't saying is that he was an exceptionally canny negotiator, very, very smart like a fox, and just kept coming back hammering and hammering, and the rest of us, we all had different jobs. Mine was numbers, right? I was the numbers person. I was the one who worked with Price Waterhouse and did the demography and everything. So the government's doing their math. You can see their little heads turning, right? And they're saying, 22,000 people, how's that going to work out? And I'm saying to Art, but Art, it was 27,000 people, because 22,000 is the number who were actually moved out of their homes, but they forgot all the ones who were already outside their house, and they forgot that, people get born. And between 1942 and 1949, a bunch of people have gotten born, so I say to Art, I'm saying, Art, it was 27,000. You got to tell them. And Art's saying, shut it up.
That's right. We sort of said to the press after about 14,000 to, not to make it so, quantify it so high. We try to keep it down, but we knew it was higher than 14,000. It turned out to be 18 in the end. The final payment was to approximately 18,000 people. But we use things like we check the insurance company studies and so on, and they think it would be around 14,000. Meanwhile, we're lying a bit, but that was okay. I think Audrey kept saying, no, it's higher, but we said, no, it's okay. So anyways, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation came into being as a result of that, and the rest is pretty much history in the sense that we were September 22nd. The other part that's really interesting is the fact that the time that we negotiated this agreement with them, only 4 people knew in government. And that was the Minister of Multiculturalism, Lucien Bouchard, the Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Don Manzakowski. Those are the only 4 people who knew. And the Prime Minister asked his staff to say to us, if you agree not to say anything to anyone until the Prime Minister's office lets us know that there'll be an announcement in the House of Commons. So it was kept quiet. And the reason for that is because they had to convince Cabinet that they would get support. And it's strange, the politics that goes on, because prior to that, when Mulroney, and I've heard this from a number of the staff people that I dealt with, that prior to that, whenever Mulroney raised redress for Japanese Canadians, he was shot down in his caucus, but mainly by one of the cabinet ministers, who was George Heath, who's the Minister of Veterans Affairs, well-respected politician, and every time Mulroney raised it, he said, no way, Japanese Canadians, no. He would not.
He said Japanese no.
Japanese no, yeah. And he was thinking of the Hong Kong veterans and so on. The veterans would not, and he would not. Well, you know what happened. In about April, George Heath becomes ill. And he's hospitalized. And so he has to resign from cabinet. It was shortly after that the tenor of Mulroney approach changed. Up to that point, it was just always a roadblock. They weren't ready to move. And then when we met in July, where Minister Wiener said everything's on the table, we're ready to negotiate, is because of things that happened politically as well that changed sort of the focus for them. And so here we are, 4 people have to go to cabinet and convince the rest of cabinet that they support this thing, the motion. And it was September 22nd. Months later, because we met on August 25th to 27th, September 22nd, September 21st, I get a call. I'm working at school. I get a call around 11 o'clock from the minister's office saying, you're come down to Ottawa tomorrow morning. We're having an announcement. We have tickets for you at the airport. All of the members of the strategy team had tickets waiting for them, and we were to be in Ottawa for that evening so that the announcement would be made the next day. Meanwhile, earlier in the morning, I get a call from the press saying, I understand there's going to be an announcement. And I said, no, I don't know of any announcement. But what happens, they sent out a trial balloon. They let some people know that that was going to happen just to see the reaction. So the press knew before we did. But anyways, we got this phone call, and the rest is history.
All right, a lot of the discussion, the real hard negotiating, of course, was over the money. But a lot of the discussion was over principles.
You're right.
And that's one of the things that will always stick in my mind. One of those principles was acknowledgement rather than apology, which has a lot of resonance with groups today. And I heard you speak so many times, so eloquently, about how we would not accept an apology. Can you briefly just give that speech again?
Well, I think you've said it. But you're right. We've always talked about this thing. Apology is, I mean, anyone could say, I'm sorry to you, but may not have much meaning. But acknowledgement, admission, is the important part. And to have the government admit that they made a mistake was important to us. And so we've always said acknowledgement rather, but usually apology is a word that's so often used. But it was not the main issue. There were other principles too. One of the things that we really wanted to make sure is that whatever happened, we were involved, because we kept saying when Japanese Canadians are removed from the West Coast, they had no say. They had no say in that action by the government. And we wanted to ensure that part of the healing process is that through the redress process that we would have a say. And that's why when we talked about negotiated settlement, it meant that we are agreeing to it. And that was a key point. And I think if you look at all the things that we did following, we were involved. Once the agreement was made, the application form for redress, it was a one-pager. And we deliberately made sure that the bureaucracy was not involved in having a 2 or 10 or 12-pager. We said one-pager, make it simple, make it easier for the people to apply. And they agreed to it. They accepted that, which was great. They also agreed to help fund some offices so that we can help our own community seek redress. So they put in $3 million to help us set up centers where we could provide lawyers and so on to help individuals with their application form, and also to send individuals out to remote areas to seek out people. They also funded for us to go to Japan, because there were 4,000 people who were sent to Japan in 45, 46, and they were eligible. And so we had a 10-city meeting schedule where they were invited to come. We had about 800 or 900 people who attended these meetings. So everything was done to try to facilitate the victims. And part of it is us being involved, and it was a way of us having the power or the responsibility. And that was important. That was always the focus. And I see a lot of settlements today where the group that's receiving compensation had no say in it. The Chinese said that's a good example. It was just one day given to them without any involvement of consultation or anything. Ukrainian internments, same thing. So the process was so important to us, for us to be involved. And one of the things that really irked me was the fact that at the very early stages, this particular group out of Toronto, they were meeting with government on the side, and they kept saying to us, we know the politicians, we have these contacts, you don't, and so therefore, and it became a disadvantage for us because we were being used, and it prevented the community from being consulted. And so this is why I always say, I always argue that community consultation, regardless of what the outcome is more important in the process than just getting something in the end.
I want to give time because I think people have lots and lots of questions.
Sure.
Just very quickly, what did the whole thing mean to you? How do you feel as a Canadian? Was it a vindication, or was it something different?
Well, for me, I was extremely proud of the fact I was involved in it. I mean, I've always said through my whole process, you know, whatever happens, my biggest concern was educating Canadians on what happened to Japanese Canadians. And I saw that growth take place over the 4 years. And so, even if redress never happened, I still felt that we had to do this, and it's important for us to do it. The fact that it came to fruition was certainly a surprise for me, certainly a joyous event. I mean, we sat there after the negotiation, we sat in the corner on the floor saying, can't believe it, it's happened, it's happened. And, you know, people in tears.
Yeah.
And I remember Roger Bata, who long fought for it, he was just in tears. And I guess that's the way I felt too, that it was just overwhelming, and certainly a very proud day for us.
Yeah.
Especially when the Prime Minister...
That's exactly what it felt like, and I remember it. I remember it very well. I also remember that, I mean, we were 6 people who were working hard. We were practically living in the same place, eating our meals together for those number of years that all of this went on, in the sense of not just the camaraderie, which of course happens when you have a joint project, but the sense of belonging to a larger community and working with that community, to me, was a game changer. It changed an understanding of the country. It changed, for me personally, an understanding of what it means to be an academic, a researcher, a writer, and the responsibilities that come with it. So it was responsibility on the part of the government, which Art just kept pressing and pressing and pressing. Take responsibility, acknowledge that you were wrong. And they did that, but it was also the sense of responsibility, I think, within the community that has carried on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think certainly the redress has revitalized our community to a great degree. We have a lot of seniors residences now that all receive funding from the foundation. Nearly all the cultural centers in our country receive funding, and it sort of helps stimulate the communities. And so I think it was very important that the community fund, when I compare it to the American redress settlement, there's nothing to help develop the communities at all in their proposals, just individuals, whereas we built in the fact that Japantown was destroyed and we had to revitalize. And so one way of doing it would be to provide funds for different projects. For writers, we funded a lot of writers to write about our history, even plays.
Scholarships.
Yeah, all kinds of things that help develop. We established a fund that's available today, Seed and Cultural Development Funds, that the NHAC, but that was part of the agreement that we made to help stimulate and maintain, sustain our community in a way. So it was important. One of the interesting parts of all this is the fact that here we're meeting in Ottawa a lot, and people would ask for your card and where your office is, and I have to admit that my office, our office, was my living room table. And all the
And hotel rooms.
and hotel room. And then all the stuff that we're doing, I had an Atari computer and a dot matrix printer, and we would be sending letters to the Prime Minister. I mean, when I think of today, I imagine, wow, what a difference it would make in terms of communication than what we went through.
Absolutely. Yeah. We do want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to ask you to stop talking for a couple of minutes. Thank you so much, Art. That was just...
Well, you're welcome.
It's an amazing story, a fantastic story, and one that we treasure partly because of you, mainly because of you as the center of this whole thing, but also because it's such an important contribution to this country, however we think of it. So thank you. Okay,
Well, that's pretty overwhelming.
and the more they clap, the less time there is for questions. So I think we can open the floor now for just a few minutes. I'm sure there are a lot of them.
Art, I was just totally riveted by what happened here. What an incredible story. And what I'm interested in is did you guys feel like you were kind of making this up as you went along to try and figure out what was the right thing to do? Did you have places you could look to say, you know, let's borrow some of those ideas? Or did you feel like this was just a totally unique moment and you had to kind of write the script yourself? I'm interested to know how you got the inspiration for the various ways that you tried to put together this deal.
Mm. Well, I know that we did a lot of research in terms of examples of, I guess you want to say, group compensation, and we found out that there was really none in Canada at all. And so this is a very unique situation for us. There were some examples of American injustices where a group had been compensated. I think there was a group in a stadium that was held because of something, and they received individual compensation. I had a woman who was involved with the FLQ, or she was one of the victims, who contacted me, and she told me her story about what happened. And again, a good example of the War Measures Act being used upon people and depriving them of their rights. But other than that, much of it, we're really, I think, ignorant of the political process as well. And so we did get some help from Tom Berger, who was involved with a lot of land claims, and Don Rosenblum. One of the people who really helped us too is someone that who was the Speaker of the House, John Fraser.
Yeah.
And John Fraser, and it was through Tom Berger that we got him contacted Fraser, but he invited us to a meeting, and he basically said, I'm a Speaker of the House. I cannot publicly endorse what you're doing, but we support you. And he said, whatever you need, my staff will help you. And so he got a meeting for us with Don Mansakowski, who was the vice chair at the time. And so he opened the ways, and I noticed in the House of Commons on the day that the announcement was made by Mulroney, every party mentioned John Fraser in their speech. And I thought, gee, he'd likely have quite an influence behind the scenes for us.
And it's John Fraser who was moved to tears at the 1981 hearings that Mr. Obata talks about the story of Japanese Canadians.
Right.
The Fraser at that meeting says, I was born in Japan, and this has had a tremendous impact on me.
Yes.
And so that comes full circle in a way to his impact on Redress. That's amazing.
Art is a natural politician. He has the instincts of a politician, and I think that's really important. But he mentions research, and there was a lot of research going on. The committee was made up of academics and lawyers, mostly, and at night, Roy's scribbling poetry that was very inspired, and we're talking about Foucault and governmentality and the building of institutions. So there was a little bit of that stuff behind the scenes, but we certainly didn't bring it up to the government.
I have a question on a different scale. Did your students know? Your students must have become aware of what you were up to. How did you communicate it to them? What was that like, being a teacher?
Tell the story about the TV show.
Oh, well, yeah, it was after one day we had a press conference and it was on national television, and I got to school and there's a kindergarten student who's just coming in, and he runs up to me, he said, Mr. Mickey, I saw you on TV last night. He says, you're a great actor. How did you know? But yeah, certainly my school division was really quite good. I remember at the time when I had a phone call from John Turner. He became the Prime Minister after Mulroney for a short period of time. And so we figured we better make inroads with the Liberal Party at the time. So we got set up a meeting with John Turner. And so anyways, I get a phone call from the Prime Minister's office saying, John Turner wants to meet with you. Not John, yeah, it was John Turner.
Yeah.
Meet you in Vancouver on this particular date, August 25th. And I said, oh my God, I don't think I could go. I said, my superintendent has called a meeting of all the principals on that day for an orientation. And this woman said, my God, he said, this is the Prime Minister who wanted to meet you. So I told that story. So I called my superintendent, I told her that story about what happened. And so she told the school board that she's more important than the Prime Minister because I was refusing to go because of her.
And John Turner was adamantly against individual payments.
Right. But we wanted at least to be able to keep the dialogue open. And this is where I said, when we were very strategic in not mentioning anything about individual to politicians. We went with negotiated agreement, and they can all live with that. But to ask them to support anything else would have been suicide, so we didn't do it. And that's part of the process. Don't take this in the wrong way, but I'll share a story, because the media was extremely positive for us. They were very supportive. Someone raised a question in the House. One of the reporters would phone me right away and said, this comment was made, what's your reaction? And so I would give a reaction. But that's the way you keep the story going in the press, whenever you have an opportunity. So one day we're meeting in Ottawa, and I'm ready to leave to check on. This woman comes running in from CBC, and she said, I want to do an interview with you. Could I have some time with you? And we're in the lobby at the hotel, and I said, gee, it's pretty noisy here, but yes, I'd be willing to do it. So I said, I have the key to my room yet. I hadn't checked. I did that. Well, I had the key. Anyways, I went up to the room, and we go in, and this woman's behind me and the woman looks at me, and she says, oh, and she's making the bed up. And I said, well, excuse me, but we have to use this room for a minute. And she looks at me, and she looks at the woman behind me, and she has this big look at her. And I said, it'll only take a minute. And then I saw she had the tape recorder, so I pointed the tape recorder to her, and then she smiled and said, okay. But those are things that happen along the way.
I think we're at time. If there's anyone else with a quick question entertain good questions?
It's not really a quick, oh, go ahead. Someone else want to go?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, it's not really a quick question, but
Yeah.
maybe, I think a lot about how the state needs to make legible marginalized communities, oppressed communities, if you want to put it that way. And I think about your stories about these fractures or these divisions in the community over time. How did you, reconcile that, or were you conscious that the state kind of needed to see Japanese Canadians as this, group altogether? Like, I don't know, how do you feel about that, or how did you feel about that?
Well, I know some ministers deliberately went out to divide our community, playing one against the other. And that's something that we had to overcome. But the other part was just the reluctance on Japanese Canadians to become engaged because of afraid of backlash. When you start talking compensation, there are some negative implications, especially with your neighbors and all of that. And so we had a lot of community meetings, small groups where we would invite maybe relatives, friends, group of 10 or 12. And interesting, once they start talking about the experiences, they've come to a realization that, holy, this is wrong. Should have not happened. And those are the people who came on side. So we did a lot of these community meetings as well in local areas. And also we had redress committees set up nationally. In Winnipeg we had quite an active group of people, and we used to try to meet regularly, let them know, and get input from them. So that's why I always say the community consultation process is pretty important. You can't do it on your own. And to give you an example, the government does polls all the time. And when we first started, the government minister said only 20% of Canadians support redress. In 1986, they took a poll. It was up around 70% who supported. By the time the agreement happened, it was even higher. So Canadians generally, once they hear about what happened, are quite supportive. It's not knowing that information, they make judgments. So I think it's important to, keep educating the public. And this is why I think it's, part of our responsibility. And this is why I'm here today. Yeah, we keep talking about it. We don't want to forget about it either. So.
And you said Japanese Canadians don't march, but that march on Parliament Hill, those hundreds of people out there, and they were noisy. I think that was a turning point in the minds of both the public and Japanese Canadians.
Yeah, despite the fact that we had people saying to us, don't do it, but we felt that we had to do it. So.
We got the signal.